They always said my brother was the star. Brandon had the charm, the confidence, the big ideas, even if none of them ever lasted past tax season. Me, I was just Becky, the quiet one, the sensible one they called me, like it was some kind of apology. My parents never meant harm, I guess. But when you spend your whole life being the background character in your own family, you start to get used to the silence. You learn to take up less space. That's exactly what I did for years. What they didn't know was that the same silence they overlooked was the one I was using to build everything. Behind closed doors, I was no junior executive. I was the majority owner of Stonebrook Capital, the company they all worked for. But I let them believe I was small, that I was lucky to be promoted. I even smiled when Brandon told me he might mentor me a bit, as if I hadn't been authorizing his promotions myself. Then came the day he tried to sabotage me completely. That was the day I stopped playing along, and if they thought I was going to break, well, they never saw what was coming next. 12 years ago, I was sleeping on an old corduroy couch in a friend's damp Portland apartment, the kind of place that smelled like takeout and wet wool, no matter the season. I was 22, juggling 2 part-time jobs, one at a copy shop, the other bartending on weekends. At night, I stayed up teaching myself blockchain development on a beat-up laptop I bought secondhand from Craigslist. I didn't have much, no investors, no safety net, but I had something my family never gave me: belief in my own quiet determination. Brandon, on the other hand, had dropped out of community college with zero plan and still somehow ended up with applause. My parents called him visionary. They cheered when he launched his 3rd business idea that year, even though each one fizzled out before it ever turned a profit. I remember sitting at a family dinner one Christmas as my dad raised his scotch and toasted to Brandon's future as a leader in American business, while I sat there folding napkins invisible. They didn't ask what I was working on. They didn't care that I had already sold my first fintech tool anonymously to a firm in New York. To them, I was just Becky Smart, yes, but too quiet to lead, too quiet to matter. So I let them think that. While Brandon was busy ordering business cards with job titles he hadn't earned, I built 3 fintech platforms from the ground up, sold them all under pseudonyms, and funneled every cent into shell companies and blind investments. I moved to San Diego, started a low-profile fund under the name E. Marlowe Holdings, and little by little began buying up voting shares of Stonebrook Capital, yes, the very company where Brandon had landed a cushy advisory role thanks to a friend of Dad's on the board. They thought I was broke, underemployed, and lucky to be there. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. The day I finalized the majority share purchase, I sat alone in my studio apartment, opened a bottle of cheap champagne, and toasted to the power of being underestimated. 6 months later, the board promoted me to Chief Strategy Officer. Brandon called to offer congratulations, his tone laced with condescension, telling me how strategy's a beast when real money's involved. I thanked him, smiled, and filed the moment away in my mind. That promotion, I signed off on it myself. The real owners of Stonebrook never knew I was behind the acquisition, just that I was sharp, maybe even promising. That was enough. But Brandon, he couldn't leave it alone. The more I climbed, the more he schemed. First, it was little comments, whispers to the COO about how I seemed overwhelmed, maybe burning out. Then came the rumors about my credentials. I knew he was behind it. I could see it all unfolding behind the glass walls of the executive floor. I stayed quiet. I gathered everything. And the night before the board's emergency session, I received a sleek black folder delivered straight to the boardroom. Inside, forged statements, fake transactions, and a list of accusations aimed directly at me. Brandon thought he'd buried me. What he didn't know was that he'd just handed me the final piece I needed. I didn't sleep that night, not out of panic, but focus. I sat in my home office, the overhead light casting soft shadows across the papers spread before me. Every whisper, every email Brandon had manipulated, every quiet backdoor conversation, I documented it all. Dates, names, quotes. He had spent the past 3 months laying a trap, confident I wouldn't see it coming. But I had. I saw every move. I just needed the right moment to strike. That sleek black folder he sent to the board, laced with lies and forged documents, was supposed to be the nail in my coffin. Instead, it became Exhibit A in the case I was building. I crafted a clean, concise dossier, not emotional, not defensive, just facts, lined up like dominoes ready to fall. At 3:17 a.m., I added the final piece, a copy of the updated ownership ledger, signed and notarized, confirming I wasn't just a board member or a CSO, I was Stonebrook's principal owner, the one person no one saw coming, not even my family. At 6:45, I brewed a strong cup of black coffee and reviewed it all one last time. By 7:30, I was sitting in my corner office, leather-bound folder in hand, watching the lobby from behind my tinted glass. At 8:45, I saw them. Brandon, confident as ever, walked into the building with that familiar smug strut, a navy blazer pressed just enough to scream effort. Right behind him were my parents. Mom wore her pearls. Dad clutched his travel mug like it was a trophy. Their faces lit with expectation, like they were walking into a family photo op, not a corporate inquisition. From where I sat, it looked like they were preparing for a coronation. They were sure the meeting was about Brandon, about his rise, about my fall. I sat back and sipped my coffee. Let them play out their little fantasy. The boardroom was just down the hall. Every seat around that table had received my dossier at midnight, each one confirmed with a digital signature. The accusations wouldn't just be dismissed. They would be dissected, and the person behind them exposed. Brandon had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the same silence that built this company's future, and now that silence was about to speak. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9 a.m. I stood slowly adjusting my blazer, calm but charged. I'd waited years for this, not for revenge, but for clarity. This wasn't just about Brandon's lies or my parents' blind favoritism. This was about rewriting the narrative they'd all clung to for too long. Just before I stepped out of my office, Elena, my assistant, buzzed in. The board's seated. They're waiting on you. I walked out, my heels echoing softly through the hallway. The air felt different, still and sharp, like the moment before a storm hits. And just as I reached the boardroom door, I heard Brandon laughing from inside, his voice, smooth too sure. She's not even invited to this part. He was wrong, so very wrong. I opened the door to the boardroom with quiet confidence. Every eye turned to me, some curious, others wary. Brandon's voice cut off mid-sentence. His smug expression faltered for the first time. "Rebecca," he said, eyebrows raised, voice tight. "This is a closed session." I walked to the head of the table without breaking stride. "Actually, I was never uninvited," I replied calmly, placing my folder on the table. Hard to hold a meeting without the company's majority owner. Wouldn't you agree? Silence fell like a stone. I could feel the shift in the air, the confusion, the dawning recognition, and finally, the discomfort. My mother blinked as if trying to process what she'd just heard. My father's jaw tightened, the travel mug in his hand suddenly looking out of place. Brandon laughed, a hollow, incredulous sound. "You're kidding," he said, eyes darting toward the board chair, Mr. Halverson, for support. "Stonebrook is publicly owned." I nodded slowly. It was. Until 4 months ago, when Archmere Holdings, LLC, completed a full acquisition. I paused, let the weight of that sink in. And I own Archmere. Gasps were audible now. Papers rustled. Someone at the far end of the table dropped a pen. The anonymous buyer who had taken control of Stonebrook, the one no one could trace, was me. Mr. Halverson looked at me with a mix of shock and something like admiration. "Is that accurate?" he asked already, glancing toward the documents in front of him. "Signed and verified," I said, motioning to Elena, who stepped forward and began distributing sealed packets. Brandon stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. "This is insane. You can't just walk in here and claim ownership." I looked at him steady and unmoved. "Careful, Brandon. You're speaking to the principal stakeholder now." His face drained of color. The confident facade cracked in real time. Mom opened her mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. Dad just stared at me, his fingers frozen around the handle of his mug. And then, without looking away from Brandon, I gave Elena a small nod. She tapped her tablet, and within seconds, the boardroom speakers came alive with the unmistakable sound of Brandon's voice. "She doesn't have the spine for leadership," he was saying in the first clip, his tone condescending casual. Another followed. "Honestly, she's a diversity win." They had to pick someone. The room went dead quiet. Each clip, each word he thought was safe in a private conversation now echoed through the boardroom. I stayed still, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. My heart wasn't racing. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt prepared. Years of being overlooked had taught me to collect receipts, to wait for the moment when truth didn't need to shout. It just needed to show up. And now, as Brandon stood in stunned silence, I knew we were only getting started. Brandon's face had lost all its color. The recordings continued to play, each one more damning than the last. There was no room left for interpretation, no chance to spin it, reframe it, or bury it beneath buzzwords and bravado. His own voice, so slick and sure in private, now betrayed him in front of every person whose respect he once craved. The board members listened in stony silence. No one looked at him. That silence, that awful, deafening stillness, was worse than any accusation. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I waited until the final clip ended, then reached into my folder and slid a manila envelope across the table. "This," I said quietly, "is the same set of forged documents Brandon sent to you all anonymously. Fake wire transfers, manipulated spreadsheets, altered communications, all designed to paint me as incompetent, even fraudulent." I let the words sink in before continuing. What he didn't count on was me collecting everything, vetting every piece, tracking every digital fingerprint. Brandon shook his head slowly. I was protecting the company. He muttered the sentence barely audible. "You're not fit to lead. You never were." I met his gaze steady. "No, Brandon. I was building something real while you played pretend with borrowed power. And now you're going to answer for what you tried to destroy." My mother finally spoke. Her voice cracked like old wood. "Rebecca, you're not really going to ruin your brother's life over this, are you?" That was the moment the deepest wound opened. Not the lies, not the sabotage, but the assumption that I was the one tearing this family apart simply because I chose not to let him succeed in erasing me. I turned to her slowly. "You didn't flinch when he tried to ruin mine," I said, my voice calm but sharp as glass. "You came here today hoping to watch me fall. That's not concern, that's convenience." Dad shifted uncomfortably, his eyes trained on the edge of the table. "We're just here to support Brandon, that's all." I nodded, more to myself than to them. "That's what you've always done. You picked your favorite. You gambled everything on the loudest voice in the room, and now you're watching it all unravel." I stood and faced the board. "I'm requesting formal dismissal of all accusations brought against me, effective immediately. I also move for disciplinary action against Mr. Brandon Ellis for unethical behavior and deliberate sabotage. I paused. And I'm submitting this material to his licensing board for further review. The finality of it echoed in the room. Brandon looked like he'd just aged 10 years. His shoulders sagged. His mouth worked as if forming words, but no sound followed. He wasn't just losing his job. He was losing the illusion of who he thought he was, and that more than the consequences was what truly broke him. But I wasn't done yet, not even close. The boardroom remained silent, but the silence had shifted. It wasn't uncertainty anymore. It was conviction. The evidence had spoken, and the weight of it was undeniable. Mr. Halverson cleared his throat, his voice careful but steady. Miss Ellis, the board acknowledges receipt of your documentation. We will review it in full, but the preliminary findings are clear. As of this moment, all accusations against you are considered without merit. A subtle breath moved through the room. I nodded, my expression calm but firm. Thank you. But there's one more matter to address. I turned back toward Brandon, who had finally sunk into his chair like the air had been punched out of him. He looked smaller now, not physically, but something in his presence had collapsed. I'm requesting that Brandon Ellis, along with our parents, be permanently banned from Stonebrook Capital property. Any future attempts to contact employees, interfere with operations, or access proprietary data should be met with immediate legal response. My mother gasped, Rebecca, we're family. You can't possibly mean I didn't let her finish. Family doesn't try to dismantle your career behind closed doors. Family doesn't watch silently while your name is dragged through the mud. Family doesn't root for your collapse and call it love. Her eyes welled up mascara, already starting to smudge. My father muttered something under his breath, but I didn't care enough to ask what. I wasn't doing this for their approval. I had chased that for too long, and it had never once shown up when it counted. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out one final folder, this one bound in dark blue leather with gold embossing across the front. This, I said, placing it gently in the center of the table, is the acquisition agreement for my first fintech company. I sold it for $50 million at 27. 2 years later, I sold the second, an auditing platform, for $180 million. I looked at my father as I said it, not out of spite, but out of truth. I could have bought you that golf club membership you always dreamed about. I could have funded every one of Brandon's failed ventures without blinking. I paused, but I didn't, because I needed to know who stood beside me when you thought I had nothing, and none of you did. They stared at the folder as if it might bite, not just because of the numbers printed inside, but because it rewrote every story they had told themselves about me. The background girl, the safe one, the one who always knew her place. Brandon's mouth finally opened. You're destroying my life, he said, voice hoarse. I shook my head slowly. No, you destroyed it the moment you tried to sabotage mine. I'm just the one holding up the mirror. I turned to the board. This meeting is adjourned, but even as I gathered my things, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. I hadn't heard the last from any of them. The days that followed moved in slow motion. Word of what had happened in the boardroom spread fast, not just inside Stonebrook, but across the wider financial community. Within a week, Brandon's name had quietly disappeared from the company website. A vague internal memo announced a leadership transition, but the real story, his disgrace, was already moving through private circles. The licensing board opened a formal inquiry. His email signature, once stuffed with flashy titles, was now inactive. My phone, however, began to light up with unfamiliar numbers. Industry colleagues, some who had never taken me seriously before, were suddenly eager to meet for coffee. Others sent cautious congratulatory messages, careful not to appear opportunistic. I responded politely but distantly. I wasn't angry. I was simply done pretending. But my parents, they didn't take the silence well. First came the voicemails, long, breathless messages from my mother, filled with tears, guilt, and half-hearted excuses. Then came the texts from my father. "You proved your point," one said. Another read, "We were just trying to help Brandon succeed. That didn't mean we didn't believe in you." But that's exactly what it meant. Their belief was always conditional, always just out of reach, given in passing or not at all. And now that the truth was out, they wanted to rewrite the past like it never happened. I didn't answer, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say. Then 3 months later, late one Thursday evening, Elena buzzed my office. "There's someone here. Says it's personal." I almost told her to send them away until she added, "It's Brandon." I looked up, surprised. "What does he want?" "Didn't say. He's alone. No suit, no briefcase. Just looks different." I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Send him in." When the door opened, I barely recognized him. Gone was the polished blazer, the carefully gelled hair. He wore a gray hoodie jeans and a face I hadn't seen since we were teenagers, raw, tired, real. "I'm not here to argue," he said, holding up his hands. "I just need to leave something with you." He stepped forward and placed a thick manila folder on my desk. "Everything I used against you," he said. "Fake emails, dummy accounts, screenshots. I'm forwarding it to the board, too. No spin, just the truth." I didn't say anything at first. My heart was steady, but my mind was trying to piece together this version of him, quiet, humbled, stripped down. "Why now?" I asked. He looked at the floor. "Because you were right. You were building something. I was imitating it and resenting you the whole time." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "I'm interning now, at a local fintech incubator. No title, no shortcuts." His voice faltered. "I don't expect forgiveness, but letting me fall that taught me something no one else ever did." He reached for the handle, and in that quiet moment, I saw a sliver of someone I hadn't seen in years. Someone still holding on to a tiny bit of hope. I watched Brandon's hand hover at the door, his shoulders slightly hunched, like he wasn't sure if he should stay or keep walking. For a second, I said nothing. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I just needed to listen to the feeling sitting heavy in my chest. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper, more complicated, grief, maybe for the years lost to a family that never really saw me. I thought about all the versions of me he had never taken seriously, the kid who stayed up late, teaching herself code, the woman who sat quietly at holiday dinners while he soaked up praise, the executive he tried to erase with a few forged documents and a smug smile. And yet now, here he was, no audience, no performance, no excuses, just the truth. "Brandon," I said gently. He stopped and turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine, hesitant but still holding on to something like he was waiting for the final verdict. "Send me your resume in a year," I said, soft but firm. Not for leadership, I added before he could mistake my meaning. "But if you're serious about doing this the right way, starting over from the ground up, we're always open to people who earn their place." He blinked. I saw his jaw tremble slightly before he gave a small nod. "No spin," he whispered. "No clever exit line." I gave the faintest smile. "Just honesty. That's all I've ever wanted." He nodded again, then turned and walked out his steps, quieter than when he came in. I sat in my chair, staring at the folder he left behind. I didn't open it right away. I knew what it contained. What mattered more was what it symbolized, the difference between who he used to be and who he might still become. After years of chasing validation, I didn't feel the need to win anymore. I had already won on my terms. But this wasn't just about a promotion or a company. It was about finally seeing myself fully without needing anyone else to clap for it. I looked out the window, the San Diego skyline beginning to blur into twilight. The harbor below reflected soft streaks of gold and navy as the sun dipped low. My office, once a distant dream, now stood as quiet proof of everything I had built, not just the company, but the resilience, the patience, the power of staying steady when everyone else doubted you. Somewhere deep inside, part of me still ached, not for approval, but for the version of family I had wished for, the kind that celebrates your wins without envy. But I also felt something else that night, a peace I hadn't known in years, maybe ever. The kind that comes when you stop waiting to be seen and finally realize you were never invisible, you were just growing in silence. And now that silence had become strength. 6 months later, Stonebrook Capital was stronger than ever. We had expanded into 3 new sectors, launched a mentorship fund for underrepresented founders, and doubled our impact portfolio. But the real growth wasn't in numbers, it was inside me. I no longer carried the weight of proving my worth. I no longer searched my parents' faces for pride or scanned Brandon's words for sincerity. I had learned that some betrayals don't shatter you, they reveal you. The people you expect to catch you when you fall may be the first to let go, but sometimes that free fall is exactly what you need to find your wings. I still get the occasional text from my mother, usually wrapped in nostalgia or guilt. I keep my responses short, polite. The door's not closed, but it's no longer wide open either, and that's okay. One afternoon, I received a holiday card. Just one line in Brandon's handwriting: "You didn't win because of us. You succeeded in spite of us." And I smiled, not for revenge, but for the quiet power of becoming exactly who you were meant to be. Here's the truth: betrayal cuts deep, but it also clears the path. Loyalty must be earned, not owed. And sometimes losing what you thought you needed is how you begin to rise. If you've ever been the quiet one, the underestimated one, know this: your silence is not your weakness, it's your becoming. Have you ever faced betrayal and found your strength in the ashes? Share your story in the comments below. And if this journey spoke to you, subscribe, not just to follow mine, but to reclaim your own.